Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Tuesday, September 24th. It's also a great pleasure today to be joined by Lola Duffort, who is a reporter for Vermont Public. She covers the education and youth beats, covering schools, childcare, the child protection system, and anything that matters to kids and families. So, Lola, great to have you back again on GNAT.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
It's been a couple of years, I think, since our last opportunity to chat, so it's great to have you back here again, and particularly at a time when education is a very hot topic. I think it's fair to say around the state, certainly down here. Everyone's still kind of trying to get over the property tax increases that came along following all the school budgets that were approved and the legislative work that was done earlier this year. But I thought just to kind of get us started, I just wondered if you could maybe tell us a little bit about what are some of the big issues that you're following on the education front.
Well, of course, I will be following the ongoing conversation about the rising cost of education and property taxes, the bill that landed in people's mailboxes, just last month. It was not a lot of fun. And people are anticipating that this year will also be pretty tough. We don't, have kind of the full numbers yet. But the trend lines are not great. Probably won't be the perfect storm that we saw last year, but should be another tough budget cycle. And in parallel to those conversations, there's also this commission on the future of public education that is meeting, and I am keeping an eye on what they are doing. We're expecting a first package of recommendations to land from them this December, and then kind of longer term recommendations to land even a year from now. So those are the big kind of tax and affordability questions that I'm going to be following. And then there's also just all of the, and as part of that, I'm following consolidation conversations that are taking place. I wrote about school closure that happened in Windham now like a year and a half ago, which I think, says something about the trends that we are facing. I'm also following the consolidation conversations that are taking place now in Washington Central, so in central Vermont. And then a lot of the run-of-the-mill stuff of schools. So, I've covered the ongoing debate about phones in schools and what to do about that. And teacher shortages, which continue to be a problem, particularly in rural districts. So, and then the other big thing I'm covering right now is the housing angle, which is a problem in so many sectors across our state, but also education. I mean, it's affecting teacher shortages, and it is also leading to a rising number of homeless students. Pretty stunning number of them, actually.
Well, those are all subjects I think we want to definitely get to and spend some time on. But first, I just thought, since there is since there was such a sharp jump this past year in the property tax rate increases overall statewide. I mean, it fluctuated from school district to school district and town to town, but a lot of people, at least down here, have been wondering, is this like sort of the prelude for next year? We're going to see the same kind of jump. You indicated that may not be the case, but didn't earlier this month, Governor Phil Scott sent out a letter saying that to the legislature, saying they needed to be careful because there was already, even if the school districts didn't spend any more money than they did this year, there was still going to be a problem keeping the tax rate stable.
Yes, I said it might not be the perfect storm that we saw last year, so maybe not as bad as last year, but we are expecting a tough budget cycle. And some of the key numbers have yet to sort of come out, so I don't want to throw like 7% out there or anything. But yes, there are some structural factors that we know are in place that set us up for budget spikes tax spikes, absent any intervention, right? One of the big problem is that lawmakers bought down rates last year, so that we weren't looking at a 20% rate increase, but instead, looked at on average 14%. And when you buy down rates, what you do is you artificially lower rates one year, but you do nothing about the kind of baseline amount of spending that is in place. So we are going to need to catch up with that, right? And that is a structural factor that's in place that will hurt. And lawmakers did that to a certain extent. Governor Scott even wanted to do that more by sort of buying down rates further with a oddly structured debt. But so there's that in place, and then we can expect healthcare to continue going up. We should note that healthcare rates for schools have not yet been released. That usually comes, I think, around October. However, we know what commercial rate increases look like. And we have no reason to believe that they will be substantially different. But we still don't know exactly what they are. And then there's just natural inflation, which is not as bad as it used to be, but it's still there. We've got increases that are built into contracts. So, all of the pieces are in place for it to be another pretty gnarly budget year. But it might not be as bad. I don't anticipate it'll be quite as bad as, when we were looking at 20% increases. I mean, one thing that's not there this time is, we don't have this kind of federal cliff, right, that we had last time. Because the ESSER money is already gone. It's gone this year. But, we shall see.
Yeah. Well, let's jump over to this Commission on the Future of Public Education that's been meeting, I think, past month or two. They sort of have a two-track agenda here, I guess. One is to kind of come up with a short-term solution to kind of like at least keep these tax rates or costs under some kind of control, or if for lack of a better term, and then the longer term question of, is the whole education funding system we have here in the state, it began with Act 60 and on through Act 68 and more recently Act 46, is that still viable? Is it still workable? Or are we at a point where the whole system needs to be rethought and reimagined? Is that kind of basically what their mission is, and are they working towards those goals so far?
Right. Yeah, I'd say their longer term mission is even broader than that, right? It's not only looking at the finance piece, but it's also looking at the governance piece and delivery piece, right? So I think, are they on track for these conversations? With these sorts of commissions, I tend to always assume that the first kind of 3/4 of their existence is just throat clearing. And really the real stuff doesn't really happen until the deadline. Because it is really hard to say really difficult ideas out loud. One thing that I have found is really interesting about the process so far is not sort of the big scary things they've put out there yet. It's it's the feedback they are already getting, right? So we are already seeing just a ton of opposition in the public comments and the people who are coming to watch. And so I think this tells us something interesting about the sort of real fear of change, and the number of stakeholders that would are more invested in the status quo than sort of some alternative.
Well, one of those alternatives is, as you suggested earlier, growing out of the story you did about the Wyndham School is that there will be, well, it would make financial sense, I guess, to close some of the smaller schools, consolidate some schools together, hopefully with the idea of achieving operating efficiencies and lowering costs and perhaps needing fewer principals or other administrators. But as you described in the story about the Wyndham School, that tends to run headlong into a lot of community opposition when it's their own local school that's kind of in the target. A lot of communities seem to look at the local elementary, middle, or high school as being, the hope of the community, or a community center, or it's a vital piece of their town identity. Um, is this going to be a situation, you think, where there'll be so much pressure to, try to get costs down to at least a level funded kind of situation, that it's just going to be impossible not to close some of those smaller schools where the enrollment is maybe on a long-term decline? I mean, we're just at a point where, like maybe 100 years ago, when a lot of one-room schoolhouses, were consolidated into other schools, and now we're now at the next stage here.
Um, I think that's already what's happening, right? I think that uh, because of the finances, at least 2 school districts, including the Wyndham district, right? Wyndham Central is not talking about wider consolidation. And the and as I mentioned earlier, Washington Central and Central Vermont, those are the towns that are around Montpelier. We're talking about closing 2 schools, and then have also started kind of talking, not so much in the immediate term, but about consolidation with Montpelier. Although I don't want to say that that's like imminent or necessarily going to happen, but it's now being floated in a slightly more serious way than it has in the past. So yes, I think the financials of it all will drive a lot of these conversations. One thing that's been interesting to me is when certain folks on the ground make an argument that some of these schools need to be closed, not because of finances, but because of sort of what smaller schools are increasingly struggling to deliver, right? And what happened in Wyndham was not a taxpayer revolt, it was a parents' revolt, right? Like, they're the ones who came to town meeting and were like, we have lost all confidence in the school's ability to deliver an adequate education. And I think there is sort of a danger of that overshadow. And I'm not saying all small schools are doing a bad job and can't, in some cases, deliver a world-class education. And I think often it boils down to like leadership in the building and whether or not they can get the staff to actually deliver that. But something that I think about a lot and worry about is sort of that piece being overshadowed by the dollars and cents. And also, I think that, closing schools sometimes saves money and sometimes it doesn't, right? Like, how you close a school, the model you go to after you close a school matters in terms of whether or not you're saving money. And so it's complicated.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, it's interesting to look at it that way, the two sides of it, the education deliverance and the financial piece of it, and both are very, very complex in the extreme. I guess I'm just
And
wondering.
I also, sorry, just one more thing. Like, I suspect that, a very plausible thing that will happen is that schools will close and that excess taxing, that new kind of taxing capacity, financial capacity, will be used to add programming, and not you know, it's very possible that it could not, it probably won't lead to a reduction in taxes, right?
Which,
And that's, sorry.
oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just thinking that this was sort of reminds me of what Act 46 was supposed to do back 8 or 9 years ago when it was enacted. That was the idea that consolidate schools and, kind of save money and also deliver better educational outcomes. But I guess the record on that is sort of still a work in progress, I guess.
Right. Well, there's evidence that it didn't save money overall, but it did lead to schools spending money in ways that we would rather they spend money on. So transportation expenses increased a little bit, but mostly the redistribution we saw was from sort of contracted services and administrative services and administrative support costs to salaries for staff and materials and student support services, which is like what we want schools to be doing. So there's evidence that Act 46 was a success. It just didn't save money, right? And I keep thinking about how some of these consolidations might lead to really good outcomes. They may not answer the political call that people are asking for, which is just less money. But they also could. I mean, like, you can save real money if you close a school. You know, Montpelier certainly did when they closed Roxbury. The big downside there was just that kids are on the bus for a really long time.
Right. Before we leave the education arena and move over to the homeless and housing situation that you've been reporting on, I just had one other thought I wanted to run by you to see if there's been any kind of conversation around this piece of it up in Montpelier or among the lawmakers you've been talking to. And I was wondering if, as I understand it, and I'm sure you know more about this than I do, but a lot of the money that goes for like mental health supports or various kinds of assistance for schools, along those lines, comes directly out of the education fund. It's part of the whole property tax system. In other states, as I understand it, that the revenue for that money comes out of a state's general fund, the broader bucket. And if one were to take out the money that goes into mental health, psychological assistance, that sort of thing for students, were separated, out from the education fund, that would cause property taxes to, hopefully decline a little bit. Is there do you have getting any sense that that's a bit of part of the conversation that might be happening up in Montpelier come next year?
Yeah, I mean, this is a perennial conversation, right? I don't. Yes, it could be. I don't know what they're going to do, right? When the commission's reports come out, this will definitely be a point that schools drive home over and over again because they are really concerned about sort of the broader social safety net tasks that they are increasingly taking on. So I don't know what that sort of disaggregation would look like. But I expect that they will keep asking for it. And we'll have to see whether or not it happens. But I can't tell you there's like X bill that would do Y.
Yeah, because I mean, that would, of course, it winds up being, taxpayer money anyway in the long run, but at least the general fund comes from a sort of a broader bucket, not just property taxes and, might soften the impact a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, it's all fungible and it's also not, right? Because property taxes are sort of it's the tax people hate the most. And even though we have income sensitivity, it is often regressive. There are a lot of people who are house poor. So, we will see. I generally expect, however, the impulse in Montpelier to be not, and I think this will be the big debate, right? And the big tension is, I think a lot of school folks will be asking for uh lawmakers to remove cost pressures from the ed fund by taking things out of the ed fund or putting in new revenues into the ed fund. And I think the larger impulse in Montpelier will be to simply look for ways to tamp down spending overall, right? And I think that's going to be the major conflict that we see, where you have one side that is, I mean, and to be fair to, folks in the school arena, there are a lot of stakeholders in that field that also want to tamp down spending and believe that that should happen. But I think the larger interest in Montpelier is to simply bring down the top line in general and not to take anything, not to pull additional general fund revenues into the ed fund or to take ed fund responsibilities and put them into the general fund.
All right, well, we shall see when they all get back together again in January with a new group of lawmakers as well. Interesting. I think there could be a lot of new faces in the State House next year. Well, let's turn to the housing and homeless situation. You've been covering that story as well. Had a great piece there about the voucher program getting to a point where a number of people had expended their eligible time in a motel with a voucher, and we're now going to be forced to find someplace else to live. And for a lot of them, it seemed like that was going to be under a tent in a campsite someplace. I mean, where are we at with this? There's a couple of hundred people that lost their vouchers this past week and are now on their own. Is that it?
Right. Well, so what happened is the beginning of a process. So we are going to see over the course of the next month over 900 households, so well over 1,000 people lose their shelter in motels. And one thing to know about the motel program is because of previous restrictions on it that have been imposed, the only people who are left in hotels at this point are people who have previously been deemed to be vulnerable by the state. So we're talking people who are elderly, who who are on like SSI, who have a disability, or families with children, right? So there are no able-bodied single males in here. um, uh, and but in the last legislative session, because of cost concerns, the legislature and the governor signed off on new changes that now kind of cap the total amount of time you can spend in a hotel, unless it's the winter. And so we're going to see this staggered wave of evictions. My colleague Carly Berlin and I were there on the first day of evictions. She followed up with a really heartbreaking story about a family that was pushed out, a family of 4 with 2 children, that are now living in a tent. And we are now currently working on a story, bigger picture, about the hundreds of children who live in the motels, and the rising problem of family homelessness in Vermont, and the fact that there are kind of a shocking number of shelter options available to them. I mean, there are fewer shelter options available to families than there are single individuals. So we know that there aren't enough shelter spaces in general in Vermont for people who are homeless, but it's even dicier if you are a family. And I think everyone would agree that children are uniquely vulnerable.
Which must also have a ripple effect on the subject we were discussing earlier in education. I mean, what are these kids going to school if they're of kindergarten or older age? I mean, there must be a lot of them who are caught up in this housing situation or a homeless situation where getting to school is not an automatic thing that happens every day.
Yeah, there are federal protections in place. Schools have to basically bend over backwards to arrange transportation and also to allow them to stay in the school of origin if they move out of district because of housing problems. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it'll happen, not through a fault of the school, but just, when kids are homeless and lose their shelter, they often fall off the radar. I was talking to a school official yesterday who was like, sometimes we find out when they disappear. Um, and and sometimes the only shelter option available to a family is an entire county away. That's if they find shelter. I want to emphasize that's if. We are talking about children camping, a lot of children camping.
What's supposed to happen when the weather gets a little colder and snow starts to fall? I mean, are they supposed to
Well,
fence all winter?
Vermont does reopen its motel program and relaxes eligibility on in well, the date changes every year. I don't know if they've set it, but it's usually sometime around December. It's either December 1st or December 15th. But it's those, they call them the cold weather rules, kick in December. But we're still, unless they change the rules, we're looking at October and November when it can also be pretty cold.
I wanted to ask you just before we have to run here, one question that came to my attention yesterday, that there is some rumor, I guess is one way to put it, floating around, I guess, on social media that a lot of the people who are homeless, part of the homeless population in Vermont, are actually from out of state. They've come here because Vermont has this supposedly generous program that they are taking advantage of, and therefore people who have been living in Vermont or have been either shut out of the program or not able to get some shelter. I found that I had a hard time believing that, but I guess I thought you would probably know better than me. Is there any truth or logic to that, or is that just another, you know, bit of fake news floating around on social media?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. My colleague Carly Berlin actually did a fantastic Brave Little State on this, which I recommend that people listen to. It's really worth it. But the short answer is no, that's a myth. It's not like there aren't people do not come here to take advantage of the program. Do some people who are from out of state occasionally wind up in the program? Yes, they usually often have ties to Vermont, right? They came to Vermont for a job. They came to Vermont to be close to family, and then they found themselves to be homeless. And one of the most illuminating things about that episode is when my colleague talked to a national researcher who was like, every place with a homelessness problem, this rumor starts to float around because people want to believe that this is a somewhere else problem and not a here problem. And this is absolutely a homegrown problem. We did this. We're responsible for it. Those are your neighbors who are homeless.
Well, we didn't have, unfortunately, I'm not gonna have enough time to kind of do the follow to that, which is to talk a little bit about where we're gonna wind up going on housing in general. I mean, that's such a massive problem, as we were talking before we went on the air, it just sort of spills over into everything, people can't take jobs that are available here because they can't afford to find an apartment to rent or a place to live. And it really, has a ripple effect on the school system and so many other things. So maybe I have to save that for the next time we have you back here, which hopefully will be sooner than 2 years, for
There
sure.
you go.
Well, Lola, thank you again very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Always interesting to talk with you and get your perspective on things. And well, in a couple of months, we'll have a much better idea, I guess, after the election's over, as to where some of all of this direction might wind up going. It's going to be an interesting couple of months for sure.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah, invite me back on.
All right, terrific. Well, and thanks again to all of you who shared part of your time with us today. Hope you found the program interesting, and we'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, take care.